So in our last video, we took a look at the Orion Nebula and we mapped it down to the smallest details. And we saw something quite extraordinary because what we see is, and what even makes this more interesting regarding the matrix, if you haven't thought about this already, is that this is a human brain, or something very similar to a human brain, but as we've seen, and so this is important when we start putting the pieces together of this matrix. It's showing us that we seem to have a connection to this place out there. We're going to see why I believe that we do have this connection out there as time goes on. What I want to do in this video is I want to build on to what we have discovered already, because there's a key part that needs to slide in here just before we start getting into the mysteries of the matrix. Because what this does is, by seeing this image of the brain out here, it allows us to now gain insight into something that nature is going to show us. And by taking a look at nature, we can learn a lot about what the Egyptians were doing as well. I believe the Egyptians had the ability to see this area. Remember, they're in the pyramid text, they specifically say, "Lo, Osiris has come as Orion. Osiris has come as Orion." And then we see in other areas of the pyramid text, when they talk about the pyramids, they say that the pyramid is the construction of Osiris. And when we take a look inside the pyramid, we see the three chambers. We see the subchamber, that represents the generative area. We see the queen's chamber, and that represents the heart area. And then we see the king's chamber, and that represents the pineal gland area. So when they say it's the construction of Osiris, now we start to get a deeper insight. Because what they're referring to is, they're referring to man on these different scales. And when we start taking a look at their reliefs and what they showed us in their reliefs, everything they did was very exact by phi and everything. And we start playing around with golden rectangles and so forth, and we start sizing them on their reliefs and checking them and see what they're doing. We realize that every single line that they show us usually has a purpose. So when we take a look at the Orion Nebula right here, we know this is a brain. Well, this is only the Orion Nebula. Now let's take a look at the whole Orion constellation and see if it sheds some light on some things. So this is the whole Orion constellation, showing all the gases and everything. Can you see with the insight that we're getting here? Can you see what nature is actually giving us now? Nature has given us the details of the human brain. It's given specific importance to this bright area, which happens to be where the pineal gland is located, right? The pineal gland is a vortex. Vortexes, they spin, and when that spin happens, what do we see right here? We see a huge Fibonacci spiral, and it goes from here and it goes all the way around, and you can see that it circles in, and the Orion Nebula right here is where the vortex ends. More than likely, this circles around a couple of times here. And where do you think that the beginning point of that is? Well, the logical place to assume would be that it is located exactly where the center of the vortex is. So from the center of the pineal gland, nature is showing us that it spirals out into a Fibonacci spiral. That concept, that insight, is extremely important, and it is the basis for what we see in the reliefs all over Egypt. So if we apply what Orion is showing us, this is what it looks like. And we see that the human body, and as we're going to dig into the details, you're going to see just how precise this is, because we have to go from the very tip of the coccyx right here. And since it's not straight above it in a line, we have to go at a slight angle and end up right where the pineal gland is located. And the way that they designed their hieroglyphs and their temples and so forth, they were puzzles. You can watch Magical Egypt, you can check into the research of Ari Schwaller de Lubic's, but their temples were a puzzle. And so when we look at the reliefs that they show us, for example, this, and this includes the Babylonians as well, they did the same thing. The Egyptians in Kamambo in southern Egypt, they used this particular relief, and the Babylonians, they used this one. This is the Tree of Life right here. You're going to notice some instant similarities, and you can tell that they're doing the same thing. The reason why, notice the way I've got the spiral. I've got the spiral the way Orion is showing us the spiral should be. But you're also going to notice that the major lines on this thing fall into specific areas. Down here, right at the tip of this pole, we have the very tip of the coccyx. And in this particular relief, it's the bottom of the tree. But now, look at the hands on both the Babylonians and on the Egyptians. They have a hand placed, and this is the way they did things. They placed things at certain levels. For example, the cobras that you see coming out of their head, those marked the brow, those marked the third eye area. You see this with this line going across their shoulders, and people think that these lines that they put on these things, it doesn't look like it's the best art in the world, but when you start digging into it and you look at it, you realize they're very exact about things. For example, the belly button that they put on these guys, because if you run this this Fibonacci spiral from the bottom of their feet to where the top of this thing is placed right on the cobra, then this mid-thigh line is exactly on their belly button every time. Also, these creases that you see inside the stone are placed at very specific locations. You might notice how this comes down at a slight angle right here, which encompasses this area from the pelvic area and the sacrum all the way up to the lumbar, all the way up to the rib cage area. So the more research you do, you realize none of this stuff was by accident, and these temples were a puzzle. And so you'll notice both on the Babylonian and on the Egyptian reliefs that their hands are placed where the heart is, and then we have the pineal. So we have these three areas. We have the generative area, we have the heart, and we have the pineal gland. And that's what they're showing us. Now, beyond that, this is where you have to start. When you start putting the pieces together and you start putting a human spine up here, you realize that they were doing things down to extreme detail. But it's very possible that somehow they found out about Orion, because they mention Orion as Osiris, and they mention the construction of the pyramid being Osiris. So somehow Osiris is related to this whole thing of the body. And remember, Osiris, his hieroglyph is an eye on a throne. So that sounds a lot like the Eye of Horus. And we find that what these different gods are, Horus, if you remember from our previous videos, is just another version of Osiris. It's like a resurrected version of Osiris. And Osiris is a resurrection god. So Horus would be a representation of a resurrected Osiris. So when we start taking a look at this now, and when you can use Orion as our model, now we know how this thing is supposed to be placed, because the center of that vortex that we saw out there is right where the pineal gland is. And when we place it this way, and we go with the three areas that were important, and we spiral it out to where the vortex is here, and our ending point is at the very tip of the coccyx, you'll notice that this line right here falls in a very specific place. Because if the vortex is here and the other line is down there, as this golden spiral gets either larger or smaller, all of these lines in here move up and down. That means that this area right here is very specific. And what it represents is it represents the start of the brainstem. And this, these two last vertebrae that you see here are the axis and the atlas vertebrae. And you're going to notice the way that that atlas fits in that relief thing. These are little puzzle pieces, like jigsaw puzzle. Like when you put a jigsaw puzzle together, they're doing it with vertebrae. And so when you put the brain up here, all this complex, detailed stuff marks specific things. And so let me show you another one real quick. Now, I don't want to digress too much on this relief here, because what I want to really do is I want to do a detail breakdown of the Eye of Horus and see how that fits into this this puzzle piece thing, because that's something that everybody would want to see anyway. I wanted to show you this spiral and its relationship to Orion, and then I also want to show you the Fibonacci spiral as it actually applies on top of the brain and as it goes down the spine. This pole that you see right here, in order for this to be correct, in order for it to work properly, it must go to where this pole, it must go to where it goes directly down and goes through the spinal cord, and then down here you'll see right here how, and I've kind of faded out so you can kind of see where this pole ends, this was staff. And you can see that the tip of that is right on where the tip of the coccyx is. And as I fade out the atlas vertebrae, you can see just how perfectly it fits in that top, this little puzzle area right here, this piece right here. And these different things, it looks like a guy with his arms up, right? But what it really is, they are puzzle pieces to the parts of the brain, because this is a guy facing to the right. So this area right here represents the pons. This represents the cerebellum. And then when these three come together up here, right at this crosshair represents the pineal gland. So all these things are placed exactly the way that they are for a reason. And so we can also see it in nature on the Nile as well, because the Nile does the exact same thing. If we place Busiris right here, then the pyramids, the Great Pyramids, end up exactly where this line is right here. And so if you place this crosshair here and this line here, the other one naturally falls down at the very bottom where you see the what appears to be on the Nile. It looks just like the bottom of a spinal cord. If you were to pull it off of a sacrum, it kind of splits into about 3 or 4 or 5 areas, like it's frayed at the end. It's exactly the way it looks on the Nile. So, so let's get into the detail of the puzzle pieces of those two areas. I want to show you how they kind of work, and so you'll understand. So after I discovered the Orion Nebula was a brain, I was very interested in the Eye of Horus here, or the Eye of Ra, whatever you want to call it. When you take a look around at a lot of these reliefs, you're going to you don't find the throne like you find here sitting underneath the eye very often. And that's what made this particular one very valuable. What I also noticed is that when I actually took the MRI from a person's skull, because you know these Egyptians, they put in their art these hidden things, these lines that if you know what you're looking for, you can place something on top of it, and all of a sudden everything falls together. And you might notice that the outline of the body of and I believe that is Thoth right there is an ibis. But you can see how the outline of this person's head follows the body, and this is his chin down here. And so I realized that they were actually using this for anatomical drawing. So when I began to pick this thing apart and see the eye on top of this thing as part of an anatomical thing, it began to make more sense, because when you take a look at the structure right here as the spinal cord comes up, you can see something very specific happening, because it kind of bends to the right, and then it comes up, and there's your eye right there. So you're going to notice if you come straight up this spinal cord right here, and you keep continuing to go straight, well, this triangular area just to the left of this eye, which is actually the thalamus, this is where the pineal gland sits. It sits in this area just behind this eye right here. And you know that because they're going straight up from there. But over here on the right, you have this eye, but check this out. So when you take a look at the pons and you take a look at the midbrain, you'll notice that they fall into this area that's purple. And so this area of the brainstem right here, this angular area that you see right here, and this stem coming up, it creates a trapezoid right here, and that allows it to fit the pons in. So all of these things, and I'm going to show you in the next drawing, this Eye of Ra is extremely important because it touches in so many different areas of the brain, and not only on the brain, but the throne And these bumps that you see right here on the bottom of this, not only did they account for the brain, but they also accounted for the skull as well in this one particular drawing. Because if everything is placed properly, you'll see how it all makes sense. So I did this diagram for you guys because I wanted you guys to see the detail in all this. I want you to see exactly why all this stuff is so exact, why they work in harmony together. The ancient Egyptians used the golden spiral to measure the body, from the sacrum to the pineal gland. And there are some very specific and many different variables that make this true. Let's start with number 1. Number 1 is located right here. And you can see that I have written here, it's the tail of the eye and marks the edge of the brain. So when we see the eye comes out right here, where this stops, you notice that the brain is at the edge of that. Okay, and that dotted line must pass through the spinal cord where the heart is and exactly through the sacrum, ending at the tip of the coccyx. Now for this to happen, and that's what you're looking at over here, you see how that dotted line, it moves right down the edge of that thing, and you notice how it passes exactly through the spinal cord, comes down here, and it ends on the tip of the coccyx. The reason that is so important is because if that is not true and the skeleton or the frame is tilted on its axis at all, then this vortex right here will not end exactly where it is, which is where the pineal gland is. So that means that the spinal column has to be perfectly erect, and that's why this Eye of Ra works in harmony with what we're seeing right here. And it also works in harmony with the golden spiral. So when we start putting all these things on top of each other, we can see why they make sense. So that covers the bottom part pretty much, showing you how the spine has to be erect. Now let's take a look at these areas over here. Number 2, it marks the top of this brow on this eye, which is pretty much the top of the temporal bone on the skull as well, if we're looking at the outside of the skull. Number 3 marks, now this right here, we have the larger golden rectangle, and then we have this golden rectangle. I call this the golden rectangle of the brain because the other one covers the body, but this covers all the details that we see on the inside of the brain. And you see the way this Eye of Ra is placed in here. We're going to get into the detail of that next. So number 3 marks the edge of the corpus callosum. Number 4, it marks the edge of the thalamus. You see this red line right here, and then we have number 5, that marks the corner of the eye. Number 6 marks the inner part of the splenium. Number 7 is right on this, it's right on the pineal gland. Now this is what's important. 3, 6, and 9, they all have to be in alignment. And if they're not in alignment, that means that this has to, this whole box, that this should be nudged up against this this bar, and you should also nudge the splenium up against this bar. That what that does is it notices it puts that vortex exactly in the same location as the pineal gland. You can see how all of this stuff falls perfectly in alignment. You get the exact edge of the thalamus, you get the exact place where the pineal gland is, you get the border of the splenium. And so you'll even notice that the spiral on the tail of this eye, that the line passes right through that on number 8. So on number 9, you also notice once again, this particular throne, the stem of that thing ends right where the axis vertebrae starts. We have the axis and then we have the atlas. So not only that, if we take a look at this as Egypt, this right here, where the brainstem starts at the axis vertebrae, is also anatomically where the pyramids of the brain are. And if we take a look at the Nile the same way, that is exactly where the pyramids, or the Great Pyramids, are located also, because the Nile Delta represents the head. So this is the golden spiral, showing you the golden spiral of the head and the body. Now let's just take a look at the Eye of Ra placement, because the golden spiral has to be placed a certain way and the Eye of Ra has to be placed a certain way for it all to be working in harmony. And when all of this is done correctly, and then you place it on top of these various reliefs, they all fit in just like puzzle pieces. So let's take a look at the Eye of Ra real quick. This one, the first one, I messed with this before I messed with the golden spiral. I will have to say that this particular one took a little while to figure out, because there are so many variables and so many things that have to be just right in order for it to work. Let's take a look. So number one, again, is the tail. Okay. Number two, you see that dotted line right there. If you were to pull that eye off, there is a gray matter that follows this area of the corpus callosum, and as you see, it gets closer to the corpus callosum, and if you were to continue out, you can see that it gets closer and closer to the corpus callosum. It follows the same line of that gray matter, and it also represents the top of the temporal bone. So number three is very interesting, because you'll notice that the angle of the top of the eye follows the same angle as the fornix, but as it goes into the thalamus area, it just kind of veers off and seamlessly moves into the thalamus. That's how you can tell you're right on that when you're checking your work. Number four seems to represent some area near this little bump right here. I think whether it's moved up or down a little bit probably doesn't matter, but I think it matters more as a reference as to the area, which represents the pituitary area. The stem that we see right here, which is number five, if you notice this dotted line I've drawn here, it creates that trapezoid like I was showing you before, and that covers this whole area, including the pons right here. Number six, which is this throne that goes all the way across, it represents an area that sits right where the cheekbone is, and this area right here is where it begins to open up into the brain, where the foramen magnum is. This also, when we're doing taking a look at the pyramid, where we're taking a look at it at the fractal size, where the pyramid is the pyramid of the head and not of the body, because when we take a look at the pyramid, they're showing us two things. They show us a person standing inside the pyramid, and you can also put a huge skull inside the pyramid, but that's very symbolic, because it shows us the inferior meeting the supernal man, both meeting with their pineal glands touching in the same area. It represents as the inferior, or not the inferior, but the smaller reaching the larger, or I guess you might call it the inferior. The inferior reaching the supernal man, kind of connecting, where you see God face to face through the pineal gland. And that's kind of the way they have it structured in the pyramid. So we have a larger head, or a skull, always facing to the right, and we're going to see that when we dig deeper into the mysteries and why that is the case. It has something to do with something called the macroprosopis. So the throne right here, as we see, it sits right along the cheekbone, and there's some other areas right here. So if you were to hold your hand up, your right hand up in front of you with your palm facing you, and then point your index finger and your middle finger down with your palm still pointing towards you, you'll notice that the bottom part of your fingers follow that same hump, and that's the way the bone of the skull looks. The bone of the skull goes right here, and then the smaller one right here starts following the skull, and that's what they did. It gives you a sign to show you that this right here should be right on the edge of that bump that comes off the skull right there. You'll notice again the end of the throne, it starts right at the axis vertebrae. So all these things have to be right on the money. They have to be exact. Once all that is done, then when you start plugging all this stuff into the golden spiral, which we saw that the golden spiral, it gave us a way to check the vortex and check and make sure that everything was encompassed properly inside here. Otherwise, we just have one piece of the puzzle. And then when we start putting it on top of reliefs, we can see how it all comes into play. Now, the reason all that detail is so important is because when we start looking at things like Egypt, because when they started naming these various cities like Busiris, Abydos, these various areas along the Nile, they represented more than just temples. They also represented areas of the body, and they speak of them in allegory. And Busiris, which is located right in the center of the Nile Delta, the place where Osiris and Ra, their souls embraced, they're saying something very specifically in allegory there. They're showing you that the spots where the soul is located, and it's right where the pineal gland is located. And so we see this copy of the Orion Nebula. We see a copy of man up there. And we can check our work and know that we placed the spiral correct because we see nature doing it in the whole constellation. And we can also see the same thing in their reliefs, and we can also check ourselves against the Nile as well. And all of those things play very significant roles, because when we start looking at things fractally, in order for the fractals to work, the larger and the smaller fractals to be placed in each other so we get the full understanding of what is being communicated to us, we have to be as close as possible. And these tools right here help us do that. So the next video we'll get into something a little bit more specific. We'll start going into the mysteries, and now you can see how this stuff is formed, and so it will make more sense to you because now you've seen it in nature, and you've seen it in the Egyptian reliefs, and now we've broken down the Fibonacci spiral and the Eye of Ra and down into such detail that you can clearly see that it cannot be placed any way else. When you have this many variables, and when you play around with this as long as I have in order to make it, to see what you're doing and see what they were trying to do and show us, because it's like a big puzzle, you realize after all of that work and after everything is positioned, it cannot be any other way. And you find that as you start moving along the various reliefs, the same things always apply. For example, you notice that that is right where the axis vertebrae starts. And we also notice the same area where that Fibonacci spiral, where that level was in that relief I showed you, that line that went across where he was holding the person's head up, it also was in the exact same area. So you start seeing the harmony of the reliefs versus what we're showing you right here. So next time we'll get into the details of some of the mysteries. We're going to start getting into the Kabbalah and show you why this whole profile of this skull and why we see that in the Orion Nebula and what it all is, what it all means. And there are some very mysterious things that I seem to be discovering about this that are almost mind-bending. I got to figure out the best way to try to communicate it to you. So you guys take care, and I'll talk to you soon.